Recording in progress. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so it always happens. I work myself up into this tremendous frenzy of excitement about an hour before class begins, and then I think, well, I should calm down. And by the time I have calmed down, I'm exhausted and I don't want to do it at all. But then you always encourage me, and we get somewhere. So, um, apparently, what we're going to talk. Oh, I try to make this a thing. Does anybody have anything that they need to begin with? And the answer is almost always no, but occasionally someone has something that, I just can't wait, and I get that. Um, so so apparently what we're going to talk about is Henri Corbin, but I guess it's part of the general trend of this semester or trimester, which is, I hope it's useful, backing off from the details of Corbin, which we may dive down into a little bit. But apparently, what I'm thinking about a lot as I read through Corbin and find it, it dense and difficult and bizarre and ancient and peculiar, and I don't have a lot of patience for it. Um, because I want to turn him into me, or some suitably altered version of a human person in the 21st century. Is that where we are? Yeah. Um, and so what we talked about last time, I think, was very much an attempt to think about personhood and hermeneutics in a contemporaneous, a modern framework into which Corbin fits, but with reluctance a little bit. And of course, I've been reading him through Hillman originally, and now with my own crazy eyes. So he gets modernized and updated, and if you're a person who doesn't feel the need to do that, it's which I believe to be totally terrific. Genuinely, I think that would be totally terrific if you, because I did that for a little while, get down inside this whatever cosmology he's constructing and operating in. Um, but but even if you're very comfortable doing that, you're going to emerge when you're done in a world of iPhones and nuclear power plants and environmental catastrophe and science and all that. One of the tricks is not to lose what he's given us when that happens to you, and so therefore he needs to be valorized for a new era, as he might say. And so I guess what may happen today is a continuation of that kind of move on my part. Um, and what have we got? So, but and I'm going to start with a question that one of you sent me last week because it might work. But just to refresh our memories, the reading selection, which I didn't change by which I just noticed, is and that's fine. From last week and this week is pages 3 through 45, and it's ostensibly about Tahwil, which is spiritual hermeneutics, and perhaps yes, we talked last time about a group of poets who had latched on to Corbin's terminology and the idea of perpetual hermeneutics. Not, I would argue, and I think this is fairly clear, because it was totally new to them, but that it was incredibly powerful confirmation for them that how they were using and how they experienced language had backup in medieval Persia and Corbin and in Western, in certain parts of Western culture, the hermeneutic tradition of biblical scholarship. And Charles Olson and George Quasha and Robert Kelly and Anne Waldman and Diane de Prima. And then there's a whole slew of people who were either touched by Corbin or touched by people who were touched by Corbin. Charles Olson probably being the first and most voluble, who everybody knew and knew about back in the 50s and 60s. And I found that extremely exciting a decade or so ago when I discovered that it was the poets who'd taken Corbin most seriously. And we're going to continue that kind of argument today, I think, because it was the poets rather than anyone who had been substantially reconstructed by modernity. And the poets, as poets, really kind of hadn't. Or insofar as they had, they wanted to get out of it, to see if they could access something more primordial about language and their relationship to the world. And it's that kind of search for the humanly, the primordial realm of human possibility that Corbin, it seems to me, helps give us access to. And I really don't, I've got these pieces floating around and I'm not at all convinced I can bring it together for you, but at least you'll get some interesting references. So I'm going to start with reading a little bit of a question that one of you, and I can't even remember who it was, so I won't reveal your identity, sent me. The important part of is this. He basically says, I can understand this stuff intellectually to a certain extent, but I don't really get it. And this person says, I just cannot wrap my mind around Ormazd having an angel which leads the way for him. I understand it intellectually, but simultaneously, I don't understand it at all. And before this morning, I had a sort of attempt. I kind of knew what I was going to say, and that's not what I'm going to say. I can't even remember it. Because one way of responding to this question, and it may be no help to the questioner, is the subject of what I'm trying to talk about today. And one way to put that is the relation between logic and poetry, but that's only one way. Somewhere, probably in the book on Ibn Arabi, but maybe it's in the Avicenna book, Corbin says that access to the creative imagination as a living reality of the soul will heal the schisms that have split the West. And then he lists a few of them, and I can't remember what they were, except he says between myth and history, and I'll ad lib now, between matter and spirit, between the divine and the secular, any of the, but and although maybe this is a bit of a heavier lift, between um, 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 literalized and um, um, literalized and misunderstood schisms between the genders. All right, because that's clearly something that's of great interest to Corbin, though, as I may have mentioned last time, his friend Denis de Rougemont didn't think he'd completed the task. But it was important for both Corbin and Jung to point out that the West, as they understood it, had seriously, at least seriously, devalued the feminine. And that doesn't necessarily make them feminists, and it doesn't necessarily change their psyches, but they were onto that, and relatively early in the 20th century. But one of those schisms that split the West you could articulate as the distinction between logic and poetry, or reason and myth. And so the short answer to the question about how to understand the notion of the angel out ahead is to stop thinking about it. With that brain. And I'm very excited about the fact that just today, or no, actually, I think it was yesterday, but in the last couple of days, I discovered a kindred soul whose work I did not know about which more in a minute. And her book has really got me flailing. And this idea that there's a use of thought which subsumes, underlies, or better, embraces the distinction between logic and poetry, or make it extreme, mathematics and music, which is something we may get to. That there's a broader vision of understanding, or better, acting and being. That seems to me super liberating. And it's the idea I've been peddling for a while now, which is that you've got to go with Hillman and what Jung was trying to do and couldn't quite, I think, and to acknowledge the poetic basis of the mind, and to acknowledge that science and mathematics are inside that. Okay. And so that the way to heal the schism between logic and poetry is to reconfigure your experience of what they're doing and why they might be different and how they might be similar. And I don't have answers to that. I mean, the question, the deep and difficult question of the really detailed view of how logic and poetry, or mathematics and music, really work together. And I think one of the points here, which is super important, so I'd put a red star by it, is that you can only investigate that in the practice. You can't think about it primarily. You have to do it a lot, and then maybe you can back off a little bit and think about it. So the suggestion is that there's a kind of mythic thinking, which is the broadest possible category. poetic basis of mind, you might call it that, or the cognitive aspects of poetry. But see, that goes off right away, and so that's that's what I want to talk about, and I kind of remember that I kind of want to start with this. Whew. And I'm going to show a few pictures, but not too many. So also, and just recently, like yesterday, I ran across, here I'm going to do my screen sharing, do the desktop. I ran across a book, an article in a book, which gave me access to this really, really cool thing. We're going to look very briefly, I only got a couple of pictures, but at the Temple of Aphrodite at Paphos, which is on the island of Crete, which I didn't know. I know about Paphos because Cy Twombly talks about it, but I thought it was a little island. And no, it's a place on the west coast of Crete. And just a minute here, and how do I make this work? There it goes. Yeah, it's over on the left where I stuck that little arrow in. All right. So we're talking ancient Greece, and we're also talking pre-Greece. This is really old. It's been inhabited since the Neolithic. It's also a World Heritage Site. And so this I copied off the UN World Heritage Site website. Paphos has been inhabited since the Neolithic. So that's primordial. If we're going back to primordiality to look at, as we're going to, the origin of Aphrodite, this is a good place to do it. It was a center of the cult of Aphrodite and of pre-Hellenic fertility deities. So this is the paganism out of which our notion of the ancient Greeks of the classical period, this is the Hellenism out of which that developed. So Aphrodite comes out of this this older stratum of fertility deities. Her birthplace was on this island where the Mycenaeans put up the temple in the 12th century BC. And there's a bunch of mosaics there, but that's not what we're going to look at. Now, so my argument, again, is that we're trying to get at a schism between what you could broadly call logic and what you could broadly call poetry. And so one way of getting at that schism, and Corbin uses it, is to look at people who did not yet have it. Okay, and that's why he goes to Persia of the Zoroastrians and then Persia of Islam. And this is a good place. Now, this this can be easily articulated. This makes a little more immediate relevance to people in the other course because we explicitly talked about Aphrodite, because that's a course on beauty. Well, it's perfect. It's super relevant to us because beauty is one of Corbin's main categories, which, I mean, is so central to him. Beauty, he says, is the supreme theophany. And although I don't know that he mentions it anywhere, he's very well aware of the fact that one of the three pillars of Islam is ihsan, to do what is beautiful. And so he's attracted to that. And he's also a great fan of the Romantics, of German Romanticism, and for them, beauty was a a cosmological characteristic. And so in Corbin's world, the hermeneutic of Tahwil, which is a spiritual hermeneutic, is essentially tied to a vision of cosmological, spiritual, and personal transformation in which beauty, acting beautifully, and being beautiful in a more than human sense is utterly essential. Now, one of the things that Corbin says, and I've got him doing it. Where do I have it? Doing it. Oh, well, I thought I did. But anyway, you have noted there's 2 times in our text where he says that the Tahwil is a reading either of a literal text or of the cosmic text, by which he means nature. So for Proclus and for some of the Renaissance Neoplatonists, and certainly for the figures of the Romantic Revolution in the late modernity, the beauty and sublimity of nature were crucial. Now, the schism that we're trying to address by appealing to something that we might call mythological thinking or the poetic basis of mind is an attempt to, I almost said demathematicize the world, but that's just the opposite of what I want to say, is to recognize the inherent beauties of logic and mathematics and the scientific enterprise as a whole, and to see those as forms of language in the very broad sense that themselves can be read in this Corbinian sense as symbols of the divine. I mean, that's a little overstated, but it isn't. But I mean, my point is, if there are any physicists in the audience, they might balk a little bit at that. And I'm trying to lead those people and that section of my psyche that has those people in it, I'm trying to lead them a little more gently than that into recognizing how much sense this schema of the poetic basis of mind really makes. So here we are in Paphos, the birthplace of Aphrodite, and it's going to be interesting. If you don't know this, I hope it comes as great a shock to you as it did to me. Here's some, and let me just say it again because I'm not sure I said it. We're interested in the primordial roots of the Western, at least, because we're in the Western tradition here with all this material. We're looking for the roots of the beautiful, and you go to Aphrodite for that, and we're trying to see. We're trying to understand beauty, obviously not in the cosmetic sense of the modern, but in the cosmetic sense of the ancient Greece, because the word cosmetics comes from cosmos, which is perfectly Greek. So, this is from an essay by a woman, an Israeli scholar named Vered Lev Keenan, who's written really good stuff. And I just happened across this essay from 2010 or so. In antiquity, she says, the Temple of Aphrodite at Paphos was a celebrated site visited by both native and foreign admirers and devotees. With its direct view of the goddess's birthplace in the sea, and I think I have a picture here. I really want to be careful not to spill the beans before I get to the next picture. Was striking in its presentation of Aphrodite without human form. What? It did not contain the common figure of the goddess as a beautiful maiden, but, as Tacitus, the Roman historian, later, it lacked a human form altogether. It was an image, Tacitus says, of a goddess without a human form. Not only did the Paphian Aphrodite lack a feminine body and a beautiful face, so characteristic of ancient representations of the goddess, but it also had no figurative aspects at all. Neither is it human, nor does it draw on any animal imagery. Rather, Aphrodite appears in a completely non-figurative or aniconic manner as a big, dark, somewhat cone-like rock. So there she is, folks. The few ancient authorities that mention the unusual appearance of the goddess express their sense of wonder, but do so without any attempt to decipher its enigmatic meaning. Tacitus emphasizes the obscure meaning of this formless object. The reason, he says, remains in obscurity. So there's a 20-page essay here, including, never mind, including lots of really interesting references. But she concludes, I mean, the bulk of the essay then, and those are all my photos, so I'm coming back now. Oh, no, they aren't. Here's a footnote, because how could I not show you Professor Maria Iacovu from the University of Cyprus, who oversees the sanctuary of Aphrodite, which seemed to me in the moment to be perfectly wonderful. So let's see. Well, I'm coming back. So Lev Keenan says, after spending 20 pages detailing the development of the various forms of representations, personifications, I might add, personifications of Aphrodite, beginning with that astonishing chunk of basalt. Actually, I haven't read any geologists on this. Some people say that it's a meteorite. I do not know if that's true, but it would make sense. I would like it to be a meteorite, and I didn't have time today because honestly, I just discovered this. But it's either basalt or a meteorite. But she spends a long time in this essay talking about, well, you know, as I recall, she says, well, after that, you get this long history of images of Aphrodite all dressed up, and she's got all these doodads and bangles and baubles, and there's other images of other personified gods or goddesses around her and so on. And then you start to get what we are typically more used to, which is a naked woman in white marble, you know. And she has some very interesting arguments about the reasons that those developments occurred, and that there was a split, you know, and there was this more abstract white marble. And of course, it wasn't white marble because they painted all those lovely marble statues. But she makes a point right at the very end, which I really like, which summarizes much of what she said. The sexual image of Aphrodite, that is, the nude, was useful for the philosophical tradition, which tends to create hierarchical dichotomies between the feminine and the masculine, between appearance and essence. And these all sound so modern, and she means them to, between the concrete and the abstract. And metaphors of, there's a useful for the philosophical tradition, and metaphors of dress versus nakedness, which stand for the opposition between lies and truth. Okay, so she's got all those schisms which split the West in her own version here, trying to rewrite our understanding of the glories of Western civilization, not to tear it all down, but to rejigger, rebalance, get everything back to something, well, not necessarily back, but forward to something that's less hierarchical, less patriarchal, and you know, that's an inflammatory terminology for some people anyway. Nobody in here, but you don't have to use that. You can just say, "Gosh, for all these thousands of years, the West has been doing this one thing, and let's not do that anymore. Let's try something more complicated, where things are rearranged, and we'll see how that works out because this isn't going so well." And in particular, the relationship between abstract thought and nature. So she says, as we have seen, however, these sets of oppositions do not hold in the case of the archaic Aphrodite. So there's another person returning to something historically old, yes, but with the idea that we could make it new. Which is one of the, here's a footnote, but an important one. One of the nifty take-home messages from Corbin in the pages that we read is he thinks it's possible to valorize a plurality of universes inside oneself and then to develop your own, personality, persona, individuation. So Keenan, I think it's evident here, she's saying, I'm not doing this as only a scholar of the ancient Greeks. I want to get something out of this in modern society and modern thought. Aphrodite's complexity escapes in this way these oppositional categories. And perhaps it's through her that it may become possible to release ourselves from their domineering grip. Ta-da! That's using history. There's a great essay by Nietzsche on the uses and abuses of history for life, which I haven't read in 100 years, but which really struck me because I think it's probably, that was years ago, but I think it's probably the same kind of argument here. There's a footnote. So I have two people in mind when I say that there are historians who are adamant that you cannot go back to the past. One of them is Ivan Illich, who just thought, as a historian, which he was among the greatest, but also a very much practicing Catholic, who didn't think that it was possible to retrieve what had been lost. I find that hard to believe, but it is true that he says that, and he can be very depressing in his later writings, that we've lost the connection to the divine and we don't have, and society's just going to hell. Of course, that's not the way I read Illich, because why would you? Why would you bother to read a historian who tells you how horrible everything is and then tells you can't do anything about it? And I suppose that's a misreading of Illich, but he can be very, very dark in his later writings. And you know, it is hard to suck yourself. It's a better metaphor. It is hard to be in a culture which is suffused with behaviors based upon these presuppositions, and to distance yourself from it and try to do something else. That's why artists and poets are very often, though not always, a little odd and a little awkward and not all that much fun to be around, because they're living in some other place and they're trying to make it present. The other historian who made the same argument, puzzlingly, was my mentor, Ed Krantz, the one that said sometimes he was afraid he couldn't get back from that extensive self, which he intuited the Greeks and Paul in the Gospels had lived inside of. And in spite of the fact that he couldn't shake the feeling that sometime he might get lost there, he was very clear that he didn't think you could recover those ancient modes of being. Corbin, bless his heart, as this kind of anti-historical scholar that he was, has no such qualms. In fact, his entire procedure is based on the fact, on an intuition of a primary human potential that is to some degree or other accessible to all of us, and via the imagination. And so here's another scholar saying, gosh, that figure of the stone, which boy, that flipped me out. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm bringing this picture to class. That's pretty great. I always have my stone. And now I'm going to have to get a little model of the Aphrodite stone so I can say, this is not only personified, it's Aphrodite herself in her most primordial manifestation. And I don't mean this as lightly as it sounds. If you're a geologist, you're right on board with that. Because you know what it's like to be attracted by the beauty, and I mean beauty in a very broad sense, the beauty, the mystery, and the enigma of any random stone you pick up on the beach. They all tell. What do? They tell stories. And yes, it requires logic and care and rigor in order to make those stories of the stone visible to other people. But if it weren't for the poetic basis of mind, you wouldn't have been the geologist in the first place. You would have been, I suppose, a consumer whose entire life is based on getting new things all the time because of, they get old really fast. So there's that. Wait a minute, back to my notes. So right. What's my segue into Elizabeth Sewell? And do I want her right away? Not yet. I'm going to take a little detour through Henri Corbin, who is the subject of this entire series of whatever these are. Can I do this? It made sense to me at the time. We'll see if I can do it now, because, okay, so there's the picture of Aphrodite, and the take-home message is, gosh, that's a heck of a way to think mythologically. Oh. So maybe it's not all maenads and cherubs and white statues of naked men and women. Maybe it's something a little grittier. And that would be no surprise to anyone who's really read Homer or Hesiod or any of the Greeks, that no, this mythology, or Hillman for that matter, this mythology gets dark and mysterious and difficult and hard in lots of senses, the stony as well as the difficult. And so it should be no surprise that mythological thinking is grounded in the natural world. Okay. One of the schisms, oh boy, there's a whole dissertation here. And I'm sure there's 50 or 60 or several thousand that have already been read on it. You know, one of the things you guys got to be careful about is the fact that I don't know what I'm talking about. So every now and then I may take a detour through something that you really know about. And so, you know, you should hit me upside the head when you do that, because you know, these are topics which are so fertile that they have been explored by lots of people. And the nice thing about that is, if you find something here that really excites you, you will find a vast literature. But you know, and think, you know, but what? So here is the thing I'm about to try to lay out. In my experience, there aren't all that many people who've approached this schism between science and mythology in the way that Corbin, and then he doesn't do it, but he makes it possible, and Hillman make possible, even Jung. Yeah, here's a little further setup of the position that I'm attacking because I have it in me, except not so much anymore. But it is still kind of a speed bump. We are, those of us who have been educated in the modern tradition, we know that the physics department is over there in that building, and we mostly don't even know where the English department is. Where, you know, because who talks to those people? Nope, you know. And the reason is this. The reason is because this schism that Keenan is aware of, and it's difficult to articulate, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. And it's also, I think, very difficult to get to its roots, because there's a part of modern consciousness that switches into science mode. And then, if you're very lucky and you didn't get captured by it, you can still switch back into poetry mode. The argument that Keenan, and then her name is Elizabeth Sewell, and we're about to do Elizabeth Sewell after the detour through Henri Corbin, in a book which I'm instantly in love with, called The Orphic Voice, first written in 1960. She's arguing the same thing that Hillman did, which is that, and Corbin, that it's imagination all the way down. The poetic basis of mind, Richard Rorty's argument that the poetic imagination is the foundation of human thought, and Elizabeth Sewell's argument is from the sciences and poetry, and I'm way ahead of myself here, but that's okay, give you an idea of what she's doing, is that no, that's really bad. You must see that science and poetry come from the same source, and they're doing the same kinds of things in different ways. But what I keep running up against in myself, and then routinely in many, but not all, of the people who write about the relations between the sciences and the humanities, if you want to do it that way, is that so often they default in the end to the sciences and logic. And I think it's kind of it was built into my brain. And one of the, okay, good. I think I've got it by segue. One of the reasons for that is because the logical scientific mind finds it very hard. It is the mind of a literalist in practice. Maybe not in theory and maybe not, always. But when you're doing science, you're operating with one or another versions of literalism. And you're working to get the truth, how the world works. And that's a great thing. And you stay away from confusion, mystery, doubt, ambiguity to the maximum extent possible. You want certainty, you want necessity, you want, insofar as you can get them. You want clarity, all those things that you don't get because they're not the point in poetry and mythological thinking. Okay. Now, one place, and this is going to turn out to be really wrong, I think, but it struck me a little bit ago. And so we'll give it a shot. So where does that distinction come from? Or better, no, I don't even want to say that much about it. What are some isomorphisms, that's a better word than homologies, but either will do, between logic on the one side and mythology on the other side? What are some homologies, some isomorphisms in Corbin's world or in the world of the ancient archaic Greeks? Well, one place you might look for that is in the distinction between necessity and contingency. And partly just for the shock value, which I hope is kind of a shock, I'm going to read directly from Corbin. I'm remembering the first time I read this stuff, The Avicennan angelology will teach us how from the primordial divine unity, and I'm speaking to the person who sent the question about the angel out ahead, although this isn't exactly about that. It's in the same voice. Okay. The Avicennan angelology will teach us how there eternally proceeds from this primordial divine unity a first intelligence or a first angel cherub whose being already contains a duality, since its own being is distinct from its necessity for being. The archangel intelligizes his principle. He intelligizes the necessity for his being by considering it from the standpoint of its principle. And then third, he intelligizes the contingency of his being by considering it in itself. I can remember reading this first time, and thinking, what have I got myself in here? The angel, archangel, cherub, and the first intelligence, and they're intelligizing themselves in three parts, and this is somehow supposed to explain the cosmology of the hierarchies of the angels. And, Jesus, even from the eternal beginning of the pleroma, here's the interesting part, a shadow arises, which is propagated from heaven to heaven. So, boom, 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 going down because we're at the top here, and the shadow, shadow arises right near the beginning, which is then whoosh propagated through the 10 levels of the angels, until after the 10th archangel, the shadow itself becomes an active intelligence or demiurge of our sublunary world, the nocturnal zone of matter. From the very beginning, then, in the heart of being arises a possibility not to be. So right at the beginning, here you've got this, and now I'm going to paraphrase because that's one of those stories where the divine being is looking around and doubt arises. Oops. and in these myths, doubt is the shadow. And it's problematic. It's not clear, and it's murky, and it propagates through the entire cosmos. And it turns in another myth, in the Zoroastrian myth in cyclical time, it gives rise to Ahriman. So, well, how do I want to do this? So that something like this bifurcation between light and dark has isomorphisms in every mythology. I mean, I can't say that, but in lots of them, and in the ones that I know about, suggests that it's pretty primordial. And it maps here onto the distinction, as Corbin tells us, between necessity and contingency. Now, God only knows what was in Ormazd's mind. Did he think necessity versus contingency? I don't know. But the later commentators certainly saw it that way. And if you carry that all the way through to, say, the 18th century, or carry it through to the 17th, 16th, 15th century, whenever it began, you've got the germ of the idea of a distinction between science and mythology. Because even Plato did this, I guess, I don't know Plato that well. Where is it when it's probably in the Parmenides, but in one of those, no, it's in that. Anyway, in one of the dialogues, he said, he does this more than once. He has Socrates say, well, at this point, it gets really confusing, and so I'm going to tell you a story rather than do logic with you and point out what you don't understand. So Plato knew that when things got really out of hand intellectually, you told a story. It was a myth. The myth was the way of dealing with ambiguity and confusion and darkness and doubt and all those negative things. Whoop, whoop, wait a minute, warning, warning. Lev Keenan would say, aha, yes, that's you see how those get hierarchized so that certainty comes at the top where the guys have it, and uncertainty and doubt gets pushed to the bottom. She, along with Corbin and others, would say, stop doing that. Go back and put your arms around the stone of Aphrodite and recognize that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be certainly doesn't have to be that schism between certainty and doubt doesn't have to be vertical. It could be left and right, left brain, right brain, mythology versus science, or even better, and here you'd bring in Hillman with his hammer to break both of those concepts up into little fragments, which then could maybe be rearranged so that you have all different kinds of certainties. You got mathematical certainty, you got logical certainty, you got physical certainty, you got theological certainty, all these certainties. And then you have a whole bunch of different kinds of doubt. Lord knows that vibrates for me and brings us back to the whole argument about emotion, which Lev Keenan does by bringing us back to the Aphrodite of Paphos. Oh, wow, you could go back to that state right now and revalue these things, So part of what I'm trying to get my head around here, and I think it's true for me, and therefore it's probably true for somebody besides me, that if you're looking for certainty, you go do science. And if you're really not looking for certainty, you go do poetry. Okay? I mean, obviously, everything I'm saying is to be taken with something of a grain of salt because it's all way more complicated than that. And there are people who go to the sciences for reasons of beauty. There's lots of reasons to do these things. And yet, they do suggest two different modes of action. Being a poet is very different from being a physicist or a computer programmer. Ooh, how am I going to bring that in? Well, let's go to Sewell. See, I know for a fact because I've done it somewhere that you can draw out. That you can draw out. That you can. Yeah, here we go. I'm not going to do it well, but you can. You can complexify this attempt, maybe we don't want to go there, to heal the schism between, let's call it logic and mythology, and try to, I'll see if I can stick to that. On Corbin's pages, you can complexify that by continuing on to the next page. Because if I stick with Corbin, I'm going to be led astray. So what you find at the end of the Avicennan descent is the world of sublunary matter. And this actually is useful, I think. One of the connotations of matter that carried to one extent or another throughout Western intellectual history is that the realm of, it didn't start that way though, is that one of the things that happened in the end is that the realm of necessity got confused with the realm of the material. And the realm of doubt and contingency got associated with the realm of the human. And these, yeah. So that by the time of the Romantics, there was an academic distinction between the sciences and the humanities, such that contingency is what you study history for, and necessity is what you study physics for. Now, a huge, enormous footnote, which will remain empty, is that the history of the relationship between the sciences and everything else is enormously complicated and richly studied. And Keenan mentions a book by Pierre Hadot called "The Veil of Isis." I think I better look it up because I don't want to give you the wrong. I get really good at this. Where's the reference to Hadot? And Pierre Hadot would be in some other life, I'll totally read this book. The Veil of Isis, an essay on the history of the idea of nature. And it's relatively recent. It was published in English in 2006, and Hadot's a contemporary French philosopher. And the book would be very pertinent here because of the stone Aphrodite, right? And so for a long time, for obvious reasons, because of my own background, I've been super interested in the relationship between the sciences and poetry and mythology, because they seemed to me, and are treated by many people, as entirely different modes of being, I suppose Corbin would say. Of course, Corbin doesn't talk about science because it wouldn't get him what he needs. And again, I'm not sure how to put these together. And so, I'm sorry, this will mean things to me that it doesn't mean to you, but it will mean things to you that it doesn't mean to me. And so that's my argument for doing it. Years and years ago in the 70s, we read Ernst Cassirer, who died. He probably died just after the Second World War. He was a German philosopher, and he was a philosopher of symbolism. He famously wrote 3 massive volumes called The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, and unlike many of his peers, he took poetry and mythology extremely seriously. And so I was very excited by him back in the day. And yet, at the end of the day, he comes out on the side of the scientists. And even Cassirer, who's got as much empathy for mythological thinking as any of the philosophers I've ever read, in the end, he can't quite deliteralize. And maybe that's not quite fair, but there is some ineradicable fundamentalism in his view of the cosmos, which leads him to say that in the end, it's the scientists who get it right. Marco, what do you got?
Yeah, no, it's because yesterday I came across a quote by Cassirer, okay? Just synchronistically. And he said something, I mean, very obvious, but I never thought that way. It's something everybody knows. We humans, we got caught in a net of symbolic thinking. So we don't have access anymore to matter. like the animals do. Okay. Uh, that was very enlightening for me. So we are just caught in this net because it's our nature. Okay. So perhaps it goes back to science because he's despaired and he wants to be an animal. Okay. And so that's the only way that he thinks humans can approach matter. So that's
through the sciences, you mean?
yeah. Just
Okay.
pure speculation because I thought it was a wonderful
Yeah.
quote. We are just caught in this. That's
Okay.
what you are doing. That's what. So it's a kind of we are unable to deal directly with nature. That's
Yes.
that's what I got from
Yeah,
the quote.
yeah. Well, you're not going to be surprised by because we keep bumping up. See, poor Marco keeps coming to my classes, and he was in one of the ones where we were explicitly trying to think about nature and ecology, and I'm still bumping my nose right now in this material that we are talking about. I'm still bumping my head up against that net. And what I'm still trying to do, Kassir be damned, is and is to yeah, he's right. So yeah. Uh, the reason, back off, because if I push too hard against that whole mess, it's going to come crashing down. The reason I mention Kassir is because, to my utter delight, Elizabeth Sewell, in her book The Orphic Voice, talks about him in exactly those terms. She I don't have it in front of me right here, but she says, even Kassir, in the end, comes down saying, if you want, so well, you need to be really careful here. If you want the most direct, this is Sewell talking about Kassir, that she says that he says that in the end we boy, yeah, this is the scholar in me being careful, which which is not something I need to do in present company. But let me just say that this is my interpretation of what Elizabeth Sewell says about Kassir, which is she says that he says, yeah, we're incredibly caught in a network of symbols. And it's the only, this is actually very helpful. It's the only access we have to reality is via our symbols. And then he's forced to say, and yet the best symbols are mathematical ones. They get us closer to the Ding on Zich, and he's a post-Kantian, so he's still stuck with that idea. For very good reasons. It's hard to escape it, that you got the appearances, and then you got behind them, you got the reality, which is the Ding on Zich here, the noumena, and then you got phenomena. In fact, that's the framing for Lev Keenan's entire essay. I forget the title of it, has to do with Aphrodite and the problem of representation or something like that. So Kassir is very much a neo-Kantian, and he sees us this is kind of useful actually for understanding Corbin. I'm about to do something Corbinian. So he sees us as each culture, and he's Well, Kassir is actually quite fascinating because he's post-Kant and he's also a post-Hegelian, so he knows cultures and history, and he's a brilliant intellectual historian. And so he says, in the end, we are, and I'm not sure this is not fair to the subtlety of his thought, but in the end, we're kind of trapped in our systems of symbols. And one culture's trapped in theirs, and another culture's trapped in theirs. And so we can't really get it at reality for reasons that Kant explained to us. But the closest we can get is probably mathematics. That's as close to the rare, to the he thought at least that the development of modern science was a significant advance in our understanding of nature. And that's hard to argue with. But it leaves you with that question. Oh, this is actually pretty good pedagogically. I'm not sure in terms of metaphysics, but pedagogically it's very useful. It still leaves you that lingering Kantian question of, but I don't want a representation. I want the thing itself. There's a poem by Wallace Stevens, which I don't have to hand, the title of which is not about the things, but the things themselves. And it may not be the title, but it's in a Wallace Stevens poem. And what Stevens is suggesting, and my argument is about to be that this is what Corbin is suggesting, that it's only by the tahwil of creative imagination that you can get to the things themselves. That a perfect poem, or in Corbin's articulation, a real, honest-to-God, full-blown visionary recital gets you the thing in itself. Because you are making it as it is making you. That's why it's creative imagination. You get as close as it's possible for a finite being to get to those moments of pure dialogical participatory creation in those moments of creative imagination, which is why Corbin says prayer is the supreme form of creative imagination, because in the act of prayer, as Corbin conceives it, you and your angel are creating each other as you go. And that's part of an answer to the angel out ahead thing. There is nowhere to go unless there's an angel a little bit out ahead. And bring in the doubt and the ambiguity and the mystery that's buried in that rock, and that's also buried in Ormazd's doubt. That's, in some sense, the motive force of the universe. There's a great Corbinian thing here. You see, I'm not going to find it. It was so good when I found it. I can't find it. I know it's on this page, so I'll have to fake it. So Corbin says it's that shit, I wish I could find it. can't articulate it. But that was it. That was it happening. That was a taste of the transformative and creative power of the Tahuil, which in its, what did we decide? Call it response. Yeah. In the call and response pattern, which is the pattern of creative imagination, because it's never solo, it's never narcissism, though it often in Corbin it can look that way, like because he's, for a number of years he's sort of contaminated by the idea of individuation as a term. And he means individuation, but as Hillman points out, it's not your individuation, it's the individuation of the angel. And that's a bit of an overstatement because it is your individuation, but it only goes hand in hand with the individuation of the angel. And it's only in that divine human syzygy, Corbin would say, that you get a taste of the real material, the real matter, so that the way Corbin breaks out of the Kantian dilemma of the thing in itself is via the activity of creative imagination. I never said that before. That's good. That is really helpful. And I think that in the back of my mind, at least, when I switch into scientist mode, or, and this comes up in a minute, not biologist mode, because biologists are suffused with historicity and doubt and confusion and statistics. And physicists, they are too now, but traditionally in the Newtonian era, they weren't. But when you make that switch from thinking like necessity, mathematics, prediction, then what you're looking for is it runs right through your fingers. You're looking for, well, one of the things that physicists are ostensibly describing is the material world, right? Mass, momentum. I mean, that's pretty much all you need is mass and F equals ma, and you can generate the entire universe with a few little bells and whistles. And so what you're looking to describe is matter, you know, something that's really substantial like Aphrodite's rock. And what you find is just quarks and energy. And it all goes away. And so you're left sort of, oh shit, I can predict things, I understand things, but I don't have any heart. I don't have the thought of the heart. And that's not true for a lot of physicists. So, but you see the point. And Corbin's going to say, as Elizabeth Sewell does, that you were looking in the wrong place and you were using the wrong methodology. I've milked enough out of that. Let's turn to Elizabeth Sewell, which may get me in a whole lot of trouble. Okay, we did Lev Keenan. We haven't done that yet. Here is... I just discovered this book and I've read about 10 pages. So as usual, I'm wildly enthusiastic about a book I have yet to read. But that's par for the course. Wait a minute. Where's the actual beginning? There's a very nice. There's a new edition published in 2022 of the Orphic Voice. So it was out of print for a long time, and it's just been published again in a edition by New York Review of Books. And I did a little, she died, oh gosh, now I can't remember. This was written in 1960. And she lived a long time and she wrote a ton of stuff. She was a it's kind of interesting from my point of view that I'm not aware of having run across her name before, because she was a sort of polymath, and a sort of eclectic anti-disciplinarian or transdisciplinarian thinker that I very much love. And one of her chief topics was, in fact, the relationship between poetry and the sciences. And I didn't know about her work. And it's got a preface by a good friend of hers, David Schenck, which is definitely worth reading. How am I going to do this? So the Orphic voice. The intuition that I have is that what she's doing in this book is very like what I'm talking about and trying to do in my own little way, which is spoken simply, is to take Corbin and Hillman primarily and use them to expand the idea of the imagination so that science and all the forms of human cognition fall underneath that rubric. But she doesn't use imagination as one of her main categories. She does, but she doesn't draw on the same, I can't even say that. She doesn't draw on the same kinds of academic sources that I'm used to seeing. And she's just fantastic. First sentence in the book is, poetry is a form of power. And I would think here of that Aphrodite stone, that's the kind of context that she's trying to develop for us, so that we could sit at Paphos, and they've put the stone in their damn museum. I wish they'd put it outside again, and we could all sit around it and read this book and books like it. Poetry is a form of power. It fell to early thought to make that power visible and human. I mean, I'm going to pause on that. Poetry, I'm thinking of the beat poets in the 60s because I know them a little bit. I'm also and Alice Notley and my hero, Leslie Scalpino. But pick your favorite poet. They all make this assumption. Otherwise, why would they bother? Poetry is a form of power. As soon as you start from that and start to work out the consequences of making that assumption, you have already allied yourself with the sciences, because they and in their form as being subsumed under economics and capitalism, which you could make a very strong argument that the sciences, economics, and capitalism are all part of this power structure, which is the sort that Corbin and Keenan and Sewell are all trying to deconstruct. So if you started with the stone of Aphrodite and said poetry is a form of power, that would be a good place to go from. Gosh, I'm so excited about that now. You see how all these pieces kind of chink, 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 chink. But, just to, the epilogue is, don't get stuck in this one. Live in it for a while. See, the other part, footnote, the other answer to the Caesarian Kantian dilemma, and this is the only one that I'd seen until a few moments ago, is you take the pluriverse path. There's is he Argentinian? Boaventura de Sousa Santos. It's him and a bunch of his colleagues who came up with the idea of the pluriverse as opposed to the colonialist universe, you pluralize things. So if you're feeling trapped and you're trying to get to the thing in itself, and this is a footnote, you're trying to get into the thing itself, and we'll set aside the creative imagination and the visionary recital. That was one answer, and a better one, and maybe not a better one, a necessary one. But another approach is to say, well, okay, I can't have the thing in itself, but I could potentially have what every culture in the universe has thought. You know, I could occupy Avicenna's universe and Ibn Arabi's universe, and I mean, pick your favorite culture, your favorite philosopher, theologian, and as Corbin says, you could integrate them all inside yourself, and that would be your perfection. And and then Kant and Cassirer would show up and say, yeah, well, you're still caught in the web of symbolism, and your response would be, yeah, but I got a lot of symbols, and that's going to be just fine. That's the other possible approach here. Okay, I don't know where that came from. But those are two approaches to solving the Kantian dilemma, and trying to get a sense of substance, in the sense of the thought of the heart, the kind of sense of substance that gives rise, out of that stone of Aphrodite, to the idea that on your deathbed you want to be able to say, I really lived. I really lived, you know. It wasn't just me thinking about it. I actually did live a bit. I think that's the sense of substance that Corbin is trying to vivify with his idea of the pleroma, you know. And to say, you know, you're not going to get that sense of substantial reality by moving furniture in the room. You're only going to get that sense of reality if you've really lived, which requires call and response and society and other people and a little poetry, you know. So poetry is then a form of power, and that's its connection with the stone. It fell to early thought. So you're one of these early thinkers, you know, and you're just getting self-conscious, and you got your Aphrodite stone that you and the guys all hang around and drink your, you know, whatever they drank, mead. The story of Orpheus is that vision and that mortality. So the story of Orpheus becomes the metaphor for her entire project here. And this is great. This is something I know little about, but I love what she says. The story, as I'm going to understand it, falls into three parts, and the first one's great. First, Orpheus makes rocks and trees move, and he subdues the beasts by his voice, music being wedded to language and poetry by natural right. So here comes all my stuff from the music courses that we did over the course of last year and a little more. Here they come, because Orpheus is not just a poet, he has a lyre. He sings. So he's a creative imaginer before the schism between poetry and song. You know, I mean, back in the day, like 1000 BC, if you listen to music, it was sung. There was always, you know, there was no instrumental group, you know, or at least as far as we know. So that singing and music and dance, calliope and terpsichore and all of them, you know, was all part of the same thing. So you got your stone, you got your beauty, you got your lyre, you got your bard, you know. And what that bard can do is to make the rocks and trees move and subdue the beasts, because it's all part of the same And here comes Corbin flying in. You see, you're reading the text of the world or of the sacred book. And so here you could see this would be a place where the original hermeneutic began, right? Because here's the language, which in very much in the sense of David Abram and Robert Bringhurst, in these archaic cultures, you sing because the world is singing. The crickets are singing, the birds are singing, there's an earthquake, the whole earth is singing, there's a volcano, it makes a big noise, So you are vocalizing because that's what creatures do. They make sounds. And sometimes they're extremely melodious, like the wind in the trees. And so you're just doing what's natural to do. Now, Sewell is super interested in language. And in my very brief reading of her, I think we have to be a little careful because you have to understand, you can't let, we or at least I can't let my antipathy for literary criticism contaminate the way in which she's using language. And she's using language in this broad Corbinian romantic sense, okay? And so his voice, which is both speaking and singing, is the primary place for the archaic task of making the power of language visible and human. You see, buried in her first two sentences is the presumption that language is, to begin with, more than human. So this would be a beautiful text to read alongside David Abram's book, The Spell of the Sensuous, where he makes these kinds of arguments. It's where I first encountered them. It's a brilliant piece of work. So here, Orpheus just knows all this stuff. And he knows how to sing to the animals, and he knows how to sing to the rocks and the trees. And then, that's the first part, after the death of his wife Eurydice, he goes into the underworld. And then there's where the doubt and it's already there in the music and the language, but in the myth makes it really specific that as a musician and a poet, he's got to go to the underworld, and he gains admittance and by virtue of his poetic powers, and he gets stuck there because he does a dumb thing, and finally he's torn to pieces by the Maenads, his head floating down the river, still singing. And then she annoyingly doesn't translate from the Latin, but it's worth reading because I found a great article telling the story of David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust as a variant of the Orpheus myth, and that's where I found the translation of the Latin. The poet's limbs lay scattered all around. I think this is from, oh gosh, who is it? I forget. The poet's limbs lay scattered all around, but his head and his lyre floated in midstream, and the lyre gave forth mournful notes. Mournfully the lifeless tongue murmured, mournfully the banks responded. Okay, so he gets torn apart by the Maenads, and he doesn't stop singing. and the natural world doesn't stop responding to him. Okay, so, all right. Well, see, in a very Hillmanian and Corbinian and Jungian way, she takes this really seriously, but not literally. Okay, and that's the whole point here, Story seems to say, she says, this is Sewell, that poetry has power. not merely over words and hence over thoughts, but also in some way over natural objects and their behavior. And to some extent, in conjunction with love, there's Aphrodite and the stone, power over life and death as humans know and suffer them. And here she's talking about the head, which was put somewhere and it kept talking. That this power is almost indestructible and may turn, even in its own disaster, to something akin to prophecy. And that's right out of Corbin, you know. This, then she says, is not a clear statement. Yeah, it does not leave the mind resolved. It leaves it wondering. Is the story in any sense true? And if so, in what way? What's the nature of the power and what are its limitations? Mythological statements lead to questions. This is a little subtle, and I finally got it, but I'm not sure I can unpack it real well for you because it gets important right now. Then follows something rather strange in our thinking about the mythology. For to these questions that we just asked, is it true? What way is it true? What's the nature of the power? For these questions, only the story itself can give us an answer. So it's kind of, I actually don't want to say that, but I'll just say it. One worries then that you've got Kant's problem and Cassirer's problem. You're caught in the network of the language. But do keep in mind the two outs, because she's going to make that move. She doesn't call it a visionary recital. But the function of poetry in Sewell's work is to break out of that network of symbols insofar as it is limiting. That's probably going to turn out to be wrong, but it'll help us get a little further. The myth turns back upon itself in what came to be called the hermeneutic circle, because it is a question that figures its own reply. And it is that inner movement or dynamic which makes it feel obscure. In my reading, this is isomorphic with Corbin's notion of creative imagination. And my argument would be, if I were smart enough to write this out, that Corbin, the function of the creative, the supreme act of creative imagination in prayer for Corbin is at work here. The inner movement or dynamic which makes it feel obscure. This kind of unclearness is not muddle or mystification, but and here comes the bells and whistles and the horns beeping. This kind of unclearness is not muddle or mystification, but an indication of method. So you see what she wants to do? She wants to give us something like poetry as methodological groundwork for everything we've got, everything that can be had. The myth of Orpheus, and for her this is the myth, is statement, question, and method at one and the same time. And then she says, this is true of every myth. And then she just puts it right down. The challenge of the Orphic statement has not yet been taken up. And if she'd, Hillman hadn't yet started his stuff in 1960, but he was on the verge of it. But my sense is she's actually, in a lot of ways, as you'll see if you look at the book, she's a little conservative. You know, all her examples are historical poets, romantics, and she doesn't cite, you know, Ken Kesey or Charles Olson. It's Browning and Goethe and Shelley and Wordsworth, and it's all those people. So she's in. Come on, you can find me. There you go. She's in a conservative, broadly speaking, kind of world of literature, but I think it applies immediately to all the things that we've been talking about. The challenge of the Orphic statement has not yet been taken up, and I think people who are great fans of Charles Olson, for example, or I would argue Leslie Scalapino, say they have taken up this challenge now. But she said no, it hasn't been taken up. It seems possible that we may have now, in the context of 20th century thought and knowledge, an opportunity to let Orpheus speak. And many of her colleagues and friends were scientists and poets. So she, in her own life and work, is explicitly attempting to bridge the gap between poetry and science in a way that I've never seen done before. There's a great woman, N. Catherine Hales, who was my first entryway into really great scholarship on the sciences and literature. And Hales must have read Sewell, but I haven't had time to look. But what Catherine Hales does is different in spirit, I think, from what Sewell is doing. And I'm very fond of what Sewell is doing because I think it's fundamentally Corbinian. The conditions for this in the modern world, that is, letting Orpheus speak, are as follows. First, we are to think of myth and poetry as an instrument of knowledge and research. Beep, beep, beep. I mean, who's got the balls to say that? This is fantastic. I mean, you see, George Steiner, the literary critic, wrote a review of this, and I've only seen references to it, in which he said, this is a brilliant and utterly maddening book. And then he concludes by saying, it's actually a great book. And if George Steiner thinks it's a great book, then it is. But this might be one of the things that's a little maddening, because we are to think of myth and poetry as instruments of knowledge and research. It's like a clash of cultures, and I just am nuts about it. Next, we have to formulate the question contained in the myth, which the myth is to answer. And this gets a little tricky. Where are we? Yeah, I'll back off a little bit because I haven't quite figured it out yet. First, there's two ways of formulating the question which the myth is asking. What power and place has poetry in the living universe? And then she restates it and says, or we could put it this way, and this rubs against me, what is the biological function of poetry in the natural history of the human organism? And that rubs against me a little bit because I got worried thinking, oh no, she's not going to try to do the Darwinian reductionism thing, is she? And no, she isn't. Because one of the things that gets done routinely, Stephen Asma does it in his brilliant works on imagination in the modern world. It's so tempting for anybody who's versed in the sciences to kind of, if for no other reason than to get tenure, you've got to say, well, I'm really not that crazy. I'm going to do a Darwinian analysis of the power of poetry. And that is not what she's trying to do. But she's trying to have it both ways, which I think is just what needs to be done. And then third, we must believe that the Orpheus story has probably been directed this way from the beginning, right from the stone of Aphrodite, and right from the beginning of the myth. That is, poetry is so obviously a form of power. What are its limits? What are its conditions? How does language work? How do I talk to the squirrels? How do I make the trees move? What is my relationship as a linguistic being with the speaking animate universe? And she says, that was the question right from the beginning, and we still don't have an answer to it, and nobody's trying to answer it except these poets. Now, and here's go ahead, Marco. What do you got? You got to unmute yourself.
No, I'm just saying hello to Erica. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's all right. No. Yeah. See, yeah. Yeah, that's fine. So, partly this is just an elaborate and very excited book review in order to get you all to go out and buy a copy of this, and I can't vouch for it yet, but this is super interesting, and this is a footnote to our substantive discussion in a way, because she then tells us the figures that she's going to be interrogating, and I gotta tell you what they are because they're really interesting. She says, I'm not going back to the stone of Aphrodite. I'm not going back to the Mycenaeans. I'm not even going back to the Greeks or the Romans. I'm going to start in the Renaissance, which is pretty cool because that's where these things really started to come apart, you see. In the Renaissance, depending on which Renaissance you want to go to, is when science started to set itself aside and make the break with, Oh, sorry, I can't bring it in. Who was I reading? Sorry, I can't go there. But around the 12th century is when Illich and Corbin say that things started to come apart in this way to produce these schisms, such as that between mythology and poetry. And Petrarch, and I don't remember if it was this class or the other one, Petrarch turns out to be super important here and in ways that I didn't know about until last week. So anyway, she's going to start with the Renaissance and advance from there, following the line of people who mention Orpheus in an important context. These are my main sources. Francis Bacon, Shakespeare, Milton, Robert Hooke, the microscopist and natural historian, Vico, Linnaeus, Swedenborg, who's one of Corbin's favorites, Erasmus Darwin, Goethe, Novalis, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley, Emerson, Renan, Hugo, Mallarmé, and Rilke. So she, in the bulk of this book, she goes through some of these, a handful of them are genuine scientists, and the others we don't think of as scientists. We think of them as poets, but we absolutely think of them as poets who were deeply interested in the relationship between the power of language and the natural world. Then she says, language and mind, poetry and biology meet and bear on one another in the figure of Orpheus. It is the double discipline of poetry and biology that we shall try to follow. How could I not have known about this woman? Now, wait a minute, because she then. Okay, all right. All I need. So that's what she's up to. She wants to watch this happen. That is, watch the split happen and work against it by pulling together people who she thinks were truly Orphic in the sense that they're trying to anchor themselves with the stone of Aphrodite. I just made that up. I don't know that there's a reference in here to Aphrodite and Paphos. That's wholly me, but it works. Language is the greatest. No, I don't have that. Language shapes our thinking and attitudes. I want to draw attention to the fact that nowadays we have almost two languages on our hands. I shall call these for the moment language as poetry and language as science. And she wants to put them both under the Orphic rubric. Language is poetry, and a poem is only the resources of language used to the full. So science, for all its utility, is a truncated form of poetic language. I taught years ago, the early 80s, I taught a team taught course with a friend of mine who was in the English department at our little tiny school. And I did the science part. We taught a course called Literature and Science. And I did the science part, and she did the literature part. And she kept asking, she said, I don't understand science. I don't understand how it works. I don't understand why they think what they're doing. I just don't get it. What? And I couldn't figure out, I didn't know how to explain it to her until finally, and some of you heard this story repeatedly, I finally said, oh, Diane, okay, so here we are in the natural world, and the archetypal science is physics, right? So I used physics as an example because it's most clear cut there. I said, well, in order to make physics work, you have to ignore almost everything. You look at matter and momentum and location in space. You get F equals ma, and you ignore everything else. And finally, you can see the light go on in your eyes. And, oh, well, okay, I get it. Because as a poet, that's not the point. The point is entirely other. Language is poetry, and a poem is only the resources of language used to the full. And there's a quote somewhere, and it might be in the introduction by her friend, where he puts it rather nicely. She calls it in a subsequent chapter, and this will work for you guys, I think. What she's going for is not the archaic pre-logical, which is what Cassirer was interested in as a historian trying to chronicle the development of what do we used to call it before we got gender conscious, the ascent of man, and Cassirer is on ball with that. And so he was interested, as many anthropologists were at the turn of the century, the last century, the thought of primitives, the pre-logical, how those benighted people used to think. She's got a great take on this, and this is her friend in his introduction. The Orphic Voice is a book designed and written to force your mind to work in an Orphic fashion, which is why he says so many commentators found it utterly maddening. He says, Sewell insists that the reader trained in linear, logical, historical methods must go post-logical, to work in clusters and concentric circles. So she's recognizing, he says, that she says, no, we can't go back to the people who are hugging Aphrodite's stone, but we can go forward. So we're not going back to the pre-logical, because we know that there's quantum mechanics. What we can do is go to the post-logical, which is a recognition of these much more open, inclusive forms of language. There's a Orpheus, who is poet and myth about itself. Orpheus, who is poetry and myth and post-logical thinking about itself, is not subject to interpretation by other disciplines. He is himself interpretation. So Orpheus is her god of hermeneutics. And yeah, this is so great. So where's the quote? What's it? So the supervening method is mythopoetic and post-logical. And it's from that point of view that you can understand the real relationship between the sciences and poetry by thereby being able to recognize that they are both methodological and research oriented, you know? I mean, that is very, very bold. I'm just completely blown away by it. And then she fleshes it out so that the argument that one makes, coming from the creative imagination, is that the experience in my tiny little world of writing poetry was clearly exploration. You're absolutely exploring, you know, what is that next word going to be, and what is the methodology? You know, how is it that I find the next word? And she says right from the get-go, that's part of what was going on here, and that to understand poetry as power makes perfect sense out of the place of the sciences in the contemporary world. It's just that it's grown up and individuated, and we need to bring it back into the family, you know, and keep it from running off and doing damage. So yeah. Yeah. The startling thesis of this book is that myth itself is an active power as well as a depiction of its own power. So this is really good. So it's like it's one of those wonderful. It was for me, beginning yesterday morning, a discovery of someone like Hillman and Corbin in her approach, but then radically different in her background and her assumptions and her references. And that's always just super exciting because it gives you all these other things to see in a different setting. And after 30 years, I got to admit, there's a sense in which I'm a little tired of Corbin and Hillman. And it's nice to see other ways of doing similar kinds of things. This was really awfully wonderful for me. And I'm a minute over. Yeah. Oh, you know what I was going to do, and I can't because we're out of time. I mean, even if what was I going to do? I had backup in case I became completely inarticulate. Oh, I know what we can do. So one of the things we can read for next time, and I will put some Corbin in too, because we want to move on to his book on Ibn Arabi. I will officially assign you that little essay that I sent around an hour or two before class. So Aaron's to an adjoining zone, because I think that's it'll at least point you to Joe Donahue. And then tonight or tomorrow morning, I'll give you some reading in the book on Ibn Arabi, and we'll take it from there. Bless you all for being interested, and I really, really appreciate your interest. And go buy yourself a copy of Sewell's book, and maybe it's as good as I think it is. I'll see you next time.
Well,
Bye.
thanks, Tom. Thank you.
Bye bye.